Nia checked her reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. Perfect makeup, diamond earrings, and a heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She smoothed the lapel of her cream-colored wool coat, willing her hands to stop trembling. Beside her, James was gripping the steering wheel of his sedan, so tightly his knuckles had turned white, a stark contrast to the dark leather. Through the windshield, the iron gates of the Ellington estate in Newport loomed like the entrance to a fortress rather than a family home. It was Thanksgiving, a day meant for warmth and gratitude, but the air outside was biting, carrying the salty chill of the Rhode Island coast. "Remember," James said, his voice tight as they crunched up the long gravel driveway lined with century-old oaks. "My mother is traditional. She just takes a while to warm up to new people. Just be patient with her, Nia." "For me." Nia reached over and squeezed his arm, trying to offer the comfort she desperately needed herself. "I know, James. I'm ready. We love each other. That's what matters, right?" James didn't answer immediately. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the imposing stone mansion ahead. It was beautiful, undeniably so, with ivy climbing the gray walls and tall windows reflecting the steel-gray November sky, but it felt devoid of life, more like a museum than a place where people laughed and ate pumpkin pie. They parked, and the silence that followed the engine cutting off was heavy. Nia stepped out, the cold wind instantly biting at her cheeks. She took a deep breath, smelling the faint, comforting scent of roasting sage and wood smoke drifting from the house, a smell that reminded her of her own grandmother's kitchen, giving her a momentary boost of courage. She was a successful marketing executive. She managed multi-million-dollar budgets. She could handle one dinner with a difficult future mother-in-law. The heavy oak front door opened before they even knocked. A woman in her 60s stood there, impeccable in a silk blouse and pearls, her silver hair coiffed into a style that didn't permit a single strand to move. It was Mrs. Ellington. Her blue eyes swept over James with a flicker of warmth before sliding to Nia. The warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a cool, appraising look that felt less like a greeting and more like an inspection. "Mother," James said, stepping forward, his voice cracking slightly. "I'd like you to meet." Mrs. Ellington didn't let him finish. She didn't extend a hand. She didn't smile. Instead, she looked past Nia's designer coat and saw only her skin color. She let out a sharp sigh of annoyance, checking her diamond wristwatch. "Finally. The agency said you would be here by noon." Nia blinked, confused. "Excuse me." Mrs. Ellington turned to a small antique table in the foyer, grabbed a stark white, starched apron, and turned back to Nia with an air of dismissive authority. "Rosa is drowning in the kitchen with the turkey, and the guests will be arriving in 20 minutes. We don't pay for tardiness." She thrust the folded fabric toward Nia's chest. "Take this. Put your coat in the service closet down the hall and get to work. Try not to break anything." The world seemed to stop spinning. The insult was so casual, so confident, that it took the air right out of Nia's lungs. She wasn't seen as a guest or a girlfriend, or even a human being worthy of an introduction. To Mrs. Ellington, she was simply the help because she was black. Nia stood frozen, holding the apron, her eyes shifting to James, begging him to correct his mother, but James looks away, saying nothing. Can you believe she just handed her an apron? If you are still watching and finding value in this story, please comment the number 9 below to let me know you are here with Nia. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend you subscribe to Black King and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single moment of the justice coming up. Your support helps us continue creating great content to inform and inspire you. Now, let's find out what happens next. The silence in the foyer stretched so thin it felt like it might snap and cut them both, but the correction Nia waited for never came. Instead of stepping forward, wrapping an arm around her waist, and proudly introducing her as the woman he intended to marry, James leaned in close, his voice a frantic whisper that smelled of mint and cowardice. "Just play along for an hour," he pleaded, his eyes darting toward the living room where guests were beginning to mingle. "She's stressed about the party. I'll find the right moment to explain once she's calmed down. Please, Nia." Nia felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was a sensation she hadn't felt since childhood, a mix of shame and disbelief. Her mother's voice echoed in the back of her mind, a warning from years ago when Nia had first started dating wealthy men. Money doesn't buy manners, baby, and it certainly doesn't buy backbone. She wanted to throw the apron on the marble floor and walk out, but the look of sheer panic on James's face held her back. She loved him, or she thought she did, and she didn't want to be the reason his family Thanksgiving was ruined before it began. With a stiff nod that felt like a betrayal of her own dignity, she turned and walked through the swinging door into the kitchen. The kitchen was a different world, warm, chaotic, and filled with the savory aroma of roasting turkey and buttery mashed potatoes. Rosa, the head housekeeper, was moving frantically between the ovens and the island. She looked up as Nia entered, her eyes widening when she took in Nia's silk dress and the diamond studs catching the harsh fluorescent light. Rosa paused, a ladle suspended in midair. She looked at the apron balled up in Nia's fist, then at the engagement ring Nia was subtly trying to turn inward on her finger. "You are not from the agency," Rosa said softly, her accent thick, her voice laced with sudden understanding. It wasn't a question. "No," Nia whispered, fighting the sting of tears. I'm a friend of James." Rosa's expression softened into something pained and sympathetic. She wiped her hands on her own apron and poured a glass of ice water, sliding it across the granite counter to Nia. It was a small gesture, silent and solid, an acknowledgement of the humiliation hanging in the air. But before Nia could even take a sip, the door swung open again. Mrs. Ellington breezed in, bringing a gust of expensive perfume and stress with her. "Rosa, check the gravy." "And you?" She snapped her fingers at Nia, not bothering to learn a name she thought didn't matter. "Make yourself useful. The caterers are slow with the drinks. Take this tray of champagne out to the living room. Go clockwise." Nia took the heavy silver tray, her hands trembling slightly. She walked out into the living room, a space filled with velvet furniture, soft jazz, and people who looked like they had never cleaned a dish in their lives. She moved through the crowd, offering crystal flutes to guests who took them without making eye contact, their conversations flowing over her as if she were a piece of furniture. She was invisible in plain sight. Then she saw him. James was standing near the fireplace, laughing with a group of men in dark suits and a young woman in a red dress who was touching his arm familiarly. He looked relaxed now, back in his element, safe from the awkwardness he had forced her to bear alone. Nia approached the group, the tray heavy in her hands. As she extended it toward them, James's laughter died in his throat. He looked at the champagne, then at her hand holding the tray, but he refused to meet her eyes. He took a glass quickly, mumbling something incoherent, and turned his back to her to resume his conversation. The rejection was absolute. He wasn't just delaying the truth, he was hiding it. He was ashamed. A guest taps Nia on the shoulder, handing her a dirty napkin. "Be a dear and take this trash, will you?" Holding the crumpled, dirty napkin in her manicured hand, Nia realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a test, and James was failing it. Memories of Paris flashed through her mind, sharp and painful in their contrast. She remembered the way the Eiffel Tower glittered behind him as he knelt, the way he had promised to build a world with her, a fortress where they would always be safe together. Standing here now, clutching someone else's trash while the man who promised to protect her sipped aged scotch across the room, she saw that fortress for what it was, a castle made of sand, dissolving at the first high tide of his mother's disapproval. The dinner bell rang, a clear, authoritative chime that summoned the guests to the formal dining room. Nia moved to set the tray down, intending to slip away to the bathroom or perhaps just leave, but Mrs. Ellington materialized at her elbow. "Not so fast," she murmured, her voice low and pleasant, masking the steel beneath. One of the servers called in sick. "I need you to stand by the sideboard and keep the water glasses full. We can't have the guests parched during the toast, can we?" It was absurd. It was cruel. But James was already seating himself at the long mahogany table, pulling out a chair for the woman in the red dress, completely ignoring the fact that his fiancée was being positioned as a servant in his own home. Nia felt a cold clarity wash over her. She walked to the sideboard, took the heavy crystal water pitcher, and stood her ground. She watched as the first course was served, listening to the clinking of silver against fine china and the hum of polite conversation. The talk inevitably turned to lineage. "It's so important to preserve our history," Mrs. Ellington said, her eyes flickering toward Nia before returning to her guests. "Tradition is the backbone of society. When you mix incompatible elements, the structure weakens. Don't you agree, James?" James stared into his soup, mumbling a vague agreement, shrinking into his suit. A woman with too much jewelry, seated near the sideboard, turned slightly and looked up at Nia. She wasn't trying to be mean. She was simply oblivious, a product of her insulated world. "You're doing a marvelous job, dear," she said loud enough for the table to hear. "So, how long have you worked for the Ellingtons? You have such exotic features for a maid." The room went silent. The insult hung in the air, gross and heavy. Nia's grip on the heavy crystal pitcher tightened until her fingers ached. She looked at James, willing him to speak, to flip the table, to say something. He looked up, his face pale, panic swimming in his eyes. "James," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Nia, please," he hissed, his voice trembling, terrifyingly soft. "Not now. Don't make a scene." That was it. The final fracture. He wasn't worried about her dignity. He was worried about the scene. Nia's hand relaxed, and the heavy pitcher slipped from her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a spectacular crash, water and crystal exploding outward like a shattered illusion. The guests gasped. Mrs. Ellington stood up, furious. "What on earth?" "Tell them, James," Nia said, her voice steady and loud, rising above the gasp of the room. "Tell them who I am." I. James stammered, looking from his mother's furious glare to Nia's expectant face. He crumbled. "Nia, please, let's just discuss this later." Nia laughs, a cold, hollow sound. She reaches into her pocket, pulling off the diamond engagement ring. "You're right, James. Not now. Not ever." That silence spoke louder than words, didn't it? If you are still watching and finding value in this detailed story, please comment the number 8 below to let me know you are here standing with Nia. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend you subscribe to Black King and turn on the bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support helps us continue creating great content to inform and inspire you. Now, let's continue. The sound of the diamond ring hitting the antique wooden floor echoed like a gunshot, marking the end of a relationship and the beginning of Nia's freedom. The room gasped again, but Nia was already moving. She turned on her heel, the silk of her dress swishing against her legs, and marched out of the dining room. She didn't look back at the shattered glass or the shattered man. In the foyer, she grabbed her coat from the closet. The white apron, which she had tied around her waist with such reluctance an hour ago, felt like a shackle. She untied it and let it drop onto the pristine marble floor, a white flag of surrender to their prejudice, but a victory flag for her self-respect. The cold air outside hit her like a slap, waking her up. "Nia. Wait." James's voice came from the porch, breathless and desperate. She didn't stop walking toward her car. He caught her arm just as she reached the door. "I can fix this," he panted, his eyes wide with a fear that looked pathetic in the moonlight. "I'll talk to her. I'll make them understand. Just come back inside." Nia pulled her arm away, looking at him with a calm that terrified him more than her anger. "You can't fix a foundation that was never there, James." She got in, started the engine, and left the Ellington estate in her rearview mirror. 10 miles down the highway, the adrenaline crashed. She pulled over onto the dark shoulder, gripping the steering wheel as sobs tore through her chest. It wasn't just the breakup. It was the invalidation of her entire existence. She dialed the one number she knew would answer. "Mama," she choked out when the line clicked open. Her mother listened to the whole ugly story without interrupting. When Nia finished, her mother's voice was steady and warm, like a lighthouse in a storm. "Baby, listen to me. Rejection is just redirection. God removed you from that table because he's preparing a banquet for you somewhere else. Dry your eyes and drive home." And she did. The next 2 years passed in a blur of late nights and early mornings. Nia deleted James's number. She poured her heartbreak into her work, launching her own consultancy firm. She traded the need for approval for the pursuit of excellence. She became a force of nature in the marketing world, her name becoming synonymous with innovation and integrity. The girl who had been handed an apron was gone, The woman who replaced her was unstoppable. One Tuesday morning in October, her assistant placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on her glass desk. It was an invitation to the Women in Philanthropy Gala in Manhattan, the most exclusive event of the season, attended by the old money elite who had once looked down on her. But this wasn't just an invitation to attend. It was a request for her to be the keynote speaker. Nia holds the invitation. They thought I wasn't good enough to serve their drinks. Now they're paying to hear me speak. 2 years had changed everything about Nia, her title, her bank account, and her confidence, but the woman sitting at table 5 hadn't changed at all. From the elevated vantage point of the stage, blindingly lit by spotlights, Nia could see the layout of the Manhattan ballroom clearly. It was a sea of black ties and designer gowns, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and old money. And there, right near the center, sat Mrs. Ellington. She was wearing a silver gown that looked remarkably similar to the one she had worn that fateful Thanksgiving, her posture just as rigid, her expression just as critical as she surveyed the room. It was almost poetic. While Nia had spent 24 months climbing mountains, Mrs. Ellington had simply been guarding the same small hill. The MC approached the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. And now, it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker. A woman who redefined crisis management and compassionate leadership in the digital age. Please welcome the CEO of Ascend Strategy, Nia Vance. The applause was thunderous. Nia stepped up to the podium, not with the trembling hands of the girl who had been handed an apron, but with the steady grace of a woman who knew her worth. As she began her speech, speaking passionately about the importance of integrity over image, she saw the moment Mrs. Ellington recognized her. It was subtle. A fork halfway to her mouth dropped with a soft clatter against the china. The older woman paled, her eyes widening in disbelief as she stared at the help, commanding the attention of New York's elite. For the next 20 minutes, Nia owned the room, and Mrs. Ellington looked like she wanted to disappear beneath the tablecloth. After the speech, the ballroom transformed into a cocktail mixer. Nia was immediately surrounded by admirers, potential clients, and city officials. She shook hands and accepted compliments with genuine warmth. Out of the corner of her eye, she watched Mrs. Ellington linger at the edge of the crowd. The matriarch looked smaller now, stripped of her home-court advantage. Finally, the crowd thinned, and Mrs. Ellington made her move, approaching with a hesitation that was entirely foreign to her character. As she stepped forward, a young waiter, rushing to clear a nearby table, accidentally bumped into Mrs. Ellington's arm, splashing a drop of water onto her expensive sleeve. Mrs. Ellington's face instantly twisted into that familiar mask of disdain. She opened her mouth to scold him, to belittle him just as she had done to Nia, but Nia stepped in. "It's quite all right," Nia said softly to the terrified waiter, handing him a napkin from her own clutch. "Accidents happen. You're doing a wonderful job tonight." She turned her gaze to Mrs. Ellington, who froze, the rebuke dying on her lips. The contrast was sharp. Nia, the one who had been treated as a servant, was treating the actual server with the dignity Mrs. Ellington lacked. The silence around them grew heavy as onlookers sensed the history between the two women. Mrs. Ellington looked up at Nia, her blue eyes filled with a complicated mix of shame and shock. "Nia," she whispered, her voice lacking its usual steel. I didn't know you were the speaker." Nia smiles, not with malice, but with pity. "Hello, Mrs. Ellington. I see you didn't bring an apron this time." The apology, when it finally came, didn't sound like victory. It sounded like a confession from a lonely old woman. Mrs. Ellington stood a little apart from the celebration, clutching her champagne flute like a lifeline. The arrogance that had once filled the foyer of the Newport mansion seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind someone tired and visibly aged. "You were magnificent up there, Nia," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "You spoke about leadership, about integrity. It made me realize how little of both I showed you 2 years ago." Nia listened, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt. She let the silence do the heavy lifting. Mrs. Ellington took a shaky breath. "James, he asks about you. He married Victoria, the girl from the Kensington family. It was the match I always wanted for him. They have the same background, the same social circles." She laughed bitterly, a brittle sound. "And they are miserable." He barely speaks to me now. He spends his days at the club and his nights in the guest room. I thought I was protecting our legacy, but I just ensured my son's unhappiness. It was a tragedy of her own making, a classic tale of valuing pedigree over personhood. Nia felt a pang of sadness, not for the relationship she had lost, but for the man James could have been if he had found the courage to stand up for himself. "I'm sorry to hear that," Nia said sincerely. "James deserved to be happy. We all do." Mrs. Ellington looked up, a glimmer of desperate hope in her eyes. "Is there? I know I have no right to ask, but is there any part of you that still cares for him? He would leave her in a heartbeat if he thought." "No," Nia cut her off gently but firmly. She didn't let the sentence finish. There was no going back to a place where she had to shrink to fit in. "I forgive you, Mrs. Ellington. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because holding on to that anger only hurts me. I forgive you for my own peace. But my future is not with James. It never really was." The older woman nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes as the finality of Nia's words sank in. She had driven away the one person who might have brought real life into their cold, stone world. "You are a remarkable woman, Nia," Mrs. Ellington whispered. "I wish I had seen that sooner." "So do I," Nia replied softly. "Goodbye, Mrs. Ellington." She turned away, leaving the matriarch standing alone in the crowd of people she had spent her life trying to impress. Nia walked through the heavy glass doors of the hotel, nodding to the doorman, who tipped his cap with genuine respect. The city air outside was crisp and clean, smelling of rain and possibility. She looked up at the skyline, a vast expanse of lights and dreams, feeling a lightness in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. She had walked into the fire of prejudice and walked out forged in steel, kinder but stronger. She steps into the night, a queen in her own kingdom, finally understanding that the best revenge isn't hate, it's thriving.